On to the third lesson about Hagar and Sarah, or Sarah and Hagar in the right order, right? um, these two ladies were interesting in the sense that they seem to be along for the ride in the story. So, and you kind of keyed in on that by saying that they weren't really a part of the covenant or the center stage, and they may have counted themselves out. Like, what's this man doing? I'm just here for the ride. I'm just trying to be behind Abraham, right? What encouragement can you give to people that feel like that they're just along for the ride, that they see the church is involved in certain things, or they read some things are in the Bible as promises, but they're like, I don't know, I see such and such that fits that mold, but I'm just here in the church as a member. I'm just here for the ride. I feel like a Sarah or even an Hagar. What nice words can you say to tell them? No.
That's not the case.
That's not the case, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that really comes down to your sense of self-worth, and when you don't have, like this laundry list of accomplishments and things, then you see yourself as worth less, or worthless, and it's just sad because that's not how God views us. It's our worth doesn't come from self. Our worth comes from the worth that Jesus paid for our sins. That's what gives us worth. But when we're focused on ourselves, it's about if our worth comes from how people treat us. And so if we have these accomplishments, then people say, oh, you did this or you did that, and then we start to feel better about ourselves, and then we go on to have better accomplishments or do more things because our worth is based on how other people see us. And then the converse is true too. If we're in an environment where people mock us or ridicule us or abuse us or things like that, then you see people that their self-worth goes down, and it's sad to see because they feel like they are worthless because people have abused them or mistreated them, and then you end up in a life of that. The less you think of yourselves, the less you accomplish, and the worse you feel about it. So it becomes this downward spiral, and that's why it's so beautiful when you are able to turn the focus from yourself to Christ and what Jesus has done for you. Because when you turn that focus to Jesus, you realize, you see the price that Jesus was willing to pay for you. And you realize self-worth doesn't come from what other people think of me.
Right.
It comes from the price that Jesus paid for me. And I am worth the life of Jesus because that's the price he paid.
Right.
I think this is maybe my favorite lesson of the 13. This one and the next one on Leah and Rachel, these two pair of ladies. What's so wonderful about this story, really, these are rescue stories of Sarah and Rachel, or Sarah and Hagar, even though we know the whole Abraham cycle, starting with the last part of chapter 11 and going on through maybe chapter 23 or 24. Abraham's kind of the father of the faith and the hero, but really there's such a strong subtext for these two women. The very first thing we learn about Abram in chapter 11 and his wife Sarah, the first thing we learn is that, and Sarah, his wife, was barren. And yet the very promise that God gives to Abraham in chapter 12, that he's going to make him, multiply him, make him a great nation, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. He doesn't say how he's going to do that, just that he is. And Abraham, of course, we know the story, Abraham believes, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And this is fundamental theology to the New Testament. But what's beautiful about this is it's only until, I think, chapter 17 that Abraham actually is told, no, I'm going to do this through Sarah, through your barren wife. And by the time he does it, Sarah is already not just barren, but she's past bearing age. So there's a double miracle involved here. Twice, because of the fears of Abraham, he passes Sarah off as a sister when he's in Egypt, when he's around powerful men, because he's afraid. he doesn't really do his husbandly duty of protecting his wife. He puts her in a vulnerable situation. But God has his eye on Sarah. Sarah is the vessel he's going to use to fulfill the promise. And so we come to these stories where God dramatically rescues Sarah, who it's easy to think is incidental. No, she is the point of the story. And I think it's beautiful, and something similar happens with Hagar, ironically, because we think of Hagar as the bondwoman who's cast out. The promise is really realized in a different way with Hagar, but she receives the same promise that Abraham does. Twice in her need, the angel of the Lord comes to her and says the same thing that God said to Abraham, I will multiply you and I will make you a great nation. It's really quite astonishing, and it happens to her in desperate situations. And I think it's beautiful. I think it's so important for us that, like Jody was saying, we're so easy to judge our worth based on our status or based on other recognition. The beautiful thing about Hagar and Sarah, it's Hagar who calls God's name El Roi, which is God sees me. And I think everyone in our church needs to realize God sees you.
Right.
Yesterday, we had a wonderful illustration of this here in Lanham. The pastor, Brother Antonio Vega, stood up, and the few times he was in the pulpit, he was encouraging participation in ministry. And he says, back on the back wall, we have our 48 ministries on the wall. Please find one that you're called to and sign up for it. You know, young, old, men, women, everybody has a place in the body.
We're asking, is that a translation error?
Yeah,
Is it
yeah.
48?
And I was like, 48? I was thinking maybe I heard wrong, but sure enough, I investigated the wall. 48 ministries, but these are, you know, these are ministries where everyone is participating in the life of the church, and it may be someone who's cleaning up the dishes at church, someone who's welcoming the visitors. It's easy to look at the minister who's on the pulpit and think, well, he's the one that's worthy and the rest of us. But the story of Sarah and Hagar are just wonderful because God takes these women and he makes them characters in this great drama that's unfolding where God is going to reveal his great promises. And of course, we know that the difference between Ishmael and Isaac, ultimately, that promise is the difference between a promise that is done through the flesh. We know how Ishmael came along, Abraham and Sarah getting a bright idea, as opposed to God's miracle working through Sarah. They both laughed at the thought that this was going to happen. And I think we all have to laugh at the thought of how God can use each and every one of us in our weakness, in our vulnerability.
Yeah.
I'm actually glad that you kind of start to separate the two promises a little, because in the quarterly, it did say that the slave girl, she got the same promise as Abraham, but you started to say, but with Ishmael, flesh was involved in a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So I'm giving you a chance to clarify now before people start to write BA and the president and the executive. So explain that clearly, that there's no like risk.
Well, if you go back to Genesis 16 and 21, these are the two stories where actually Hagar is on the run. She's running away. She's being cast out of the presence of Abraham and Sarah. In both cases, God comes to her rescue and encourages her and tells her, hey, I see you, and I have a future for you too. And the similarity that we're looking at with the promises is just as God promised Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation, I'm going to multiply you. He says the same thing to Hagar, I'm going to make you a great nation and I'm going to multiply you, in those two chapters. We know from those very chapters that God tells Abraham, your descendants will be named through Isaac. In other words, the difference between the promises is not that God's not going to multiply Abraham and Hagar through Ishmael, because he is, and he fulfilled that promise. Became a great people, Ishmael did. The primary difference is how those promises were realized. Paul makes a big point of this in Galatians 3 and 4. The promise is not through the flesh. It's not just through biological generation. as lovely and important of a gift that is, this was by promise. God says, I'm going to do something through Abraham and Sarah. Primarily, he's going to do something through Sarah that is impossible for human beings. And that is the story of Isaac. Isaac is the impossibility of a kind of rescue that's more than just a genetic propagation. It's that promise that God's miracle is at work in each and every one of us to eternal life. Only God can do that. And so while there's a similarity in the two promises, the pairs of promises he gave Abraham and he gave Hagar, there's a real difference in the nature of the the realization of those promises through Ishmael and Isaac.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. I mean, if you look in Galatians where Paul talks about, you know, really contrasting the two. I mean, talks
Flesh and spirit.
about that Hagar was born, you know, or bore a son of the flesh, whereas Sarah's was born of the promise. So you see that strong distinction between the two, and we know, of course, that promise ended up in the promise of Jesus through the lineage of Isaac.
It's amazing that Sarah and Hagar end up in Galatians. Here are these two women that we're talking about end up really in the centerpiece of Paul's theology of Christ and the New Covenant. And he compares these two women to the Old Covenant and New Covenant. So it's remarkable that these women who maybe it's easy to look over as we're concentrating on Abraham really become key players in this whole narrative of God rescuing his people.
Yeah, but I think, you know, it's just neat to see, you know, that you know, you've got the big story of Abraham, but you've got these tender moments of God working with Sarah, protecting Sarah's integrity in, you know, when she was in Egypt, and said, you know, that he was going to, that he was going to, you know, protect her integrity, and then you've got him with Hagar, you know, with tears running down her face out in the middle of the desert. That, you know, in both, you know, and especially in Hagar's case, you know, it's things that she'd done wrong. You know, that she had been kind of haughty toward Sarah, but God still forgave her, and he saw her tears. And the same thing with Sarah, that Sarah did things wrong too. She was, because of her own maybe sense of poor self-worth, she encouraged you know, Abraham to take Hagar and have a son through her. And then right after that, then she regretted it, because then she realized, you know, that her self-worth even dropped further as now the slave girl is trying to elevate herself above her, and she rebels against that and has to say, no, this is not happening. I'm not going to just keep going down in my self-worth. You know.
I think we're caught up. We're really caught up in the natural when you think about it, in the possible. You know, well, that's not realistic. You know, and I can just see Sarah and Abraham having this conversation. You know, I don't know how it goes. He just said we're going to have a family, and it's going to be a big family, and all the families of the earth are going to be blessed through it. I don't know how he's going to do that. Well, surely it must be something that we can help God out with. You know, it makes perfect sense from our carnal natures, and it's like, well, these are the options. You know, but God has got a much bigger story to tell. And I think we need to return to that sacramental kind of existence where we really do anticipate the miracle of God in us, that really God can do above all that we ask or think, because his power is residing in us. And so being ready for those moments of realization where you find yourself in circumstances that are impossible, and yet all of a sudden God is doing something that, boy, I didn't see that coming. And I think that's exciting. That's what makes the Christian faith so vital, is because it really is built around resurrection. And dead people don't raise up, but Jesus did, and that gives us all possibility of newness of life in ways that we would have never anticipated.
So even Sarah and Hagar and anyone today, don't count yourself out if God is involved in rescue and restoration.
Amen.